Hello and welcome to this review of my Dell QuietKey. I figured it's high time we take a look at another good rubber dome keyboard again. Dell had an enormous amount of these made, so they're very common, but there are several different models which have some differences between them. Most QuietKeys were made by Silatech, the company that also made the earlier AT101 keyboard, and indeed the QuietKey seems to be a continuation of the rubber dome model of the AT101 which Silatech introduced. Originally they came with Silatech's discrete conductive rubber domes which came in a variety of colors, but as with most keyboards the model basically got cheapified over time to save costs, and they eventually moved towards using the more standard rubber dome sheet. This particular one, however, was made by NMB and uses their dome with slider switches, which are instantly recognizable. I've covered these switches briefly in my dome with slider mega review, and NMB dome with slider is one of the better ones. It's also by far the most common type of dome with slider switch out there. I've found so many keyboards of widely varying models with these in it that I just stopped collecting them after a while. This one I bought new old stock at the recycling centre for £50 the day before I left the UK. The system they used is kind of funny. There are a lot of different implementations of dome with slider switches, but this one uses single domes that have been glued to the top membrane. It seems like a rather circuitous approach to a rubber dome mat, but it works a lot better than it does in most cases. The domes could come in a whole bunch of different colors. After I stopped collecting these keyboards, I still key-pulled NMB keyboards to see if I could find ones with a different color of dome, and these are the ones I've found to date. Whether the color is any significance I'm not sure, but the most common ones are yellow and dark blue, the latter of which is the type in this particular QuietKey. The slider is this curious spider-looking thingamajig bob which sits on top of the dome. It actually goes slightly around it, and one of the advantages that a dome with slider keyboard like this can give you is that the legs hit the bottom of the keyboard before you press down on the rubber dome too far, which helps mitigate the mushiness of traditional rubber domes to a large degree. They also came with black and grey sliders, but the white slider version is by far the most common. The rubber cups are also very tactile, much more tactile than on most other rubber dome keyboards, and this gives a much firmer, surer typing feel. It's nice. There is some scratchiness to it, but not a lot. It's an overall pretty okay typing feel. The biggest disadvantage to these is something more or less inherent to rubber dome over membrane keyboards. You need to bottom out before the key registers. In my opinion, one of the best things about mechanical keyboards is that they don't have this and are designed to actuate partway through the key travel, usually around halfway, which results in a much more relaxed typing feel. Now, there isn't actually a true definition of what makes a keyboard mechanical, there's a whole bunch of different opinions on this, but not a true dictionary term. One common opinion is that it's mechanical if it regards discrete switches, such as Cherry MX, Alps SKCM, etc. But this definition excludes things like the models M and F, which seems a bit weird, as they're among the most famous and celebrated mechanical keyboards. This definition also excludes several others like switch grids, which would then be considered mechanical if you separated the switch units, but this changes nothing about the actual mechanism, so this is not a very good definition in my opinion. Another common opinion is that the switch should contain a spring. Again, this has several deficiencies in my opinion because this excludes tactile foam and foil switches, which often came with a buckling rubber sleeve, but not linear foam and foil switches, which used a coil spring. And that seems rather arbitrary. I mean, why would the linear version of a switch be considered mechanical, but not the tactile one? If you only count coil springs, it also excludes leaf spring switches like Fujitsu's, which is again rather stupid. Yet another theory is that it shouldn't rely on a sensing membrane, but again this rules out the Model M, which most people don't realize is actually a membrane keyboard, and it also rules out most other buckling spring switches, as well as the Acer switch, which many people would consider a mechanical switch. It just happens to sit on top of a membrane rather than on top of a PCB or something. An easier, more black and white definition is that it shouldn't contain rubber domes, which is one of the definitions I'm more closely aligned with, but even this has its limitations. For example, integrated dome switches, of which there are several designs, are self-contained units soldered into a PCB, with electrodes and everything and no membrane, but it just happens to use a discrete rubber dome as the tactile and return element, and I still think that should count as mechanical somehow. Also, it excludes Topra, which is obviously a rubber dome system, but at the same time it's sophisticated and high quality enough that I think it's not really doing it justice just to throw it in with the paupers. There's clearly more to this design than that. An opinion that's not mainstream at all, but which I think actually holds some merit, is that of a system that allows you to actuate before bottoming out. Now, this might seem a bit arbitrary, but in my opinion this actually holds some sway, because you're sorting in a very practical way, namely by one of the biggest virtues that mechanical switches have to offer. This definition does actually include Topra. My own definition of mechanical is basically a combination of these. If it's a discrete unit, registers before bottoming out, or doesn't contain rubber domes, it's mechanical. Or at least enough to set it apart from a standard keyboard, which is really the whole point of the definition of mechanical, to say that it's something more than the norm. But again, that's just what I think. Anyway, coming back to the QuietKey, I took this little detour to show you that although this keyboard is obviously a big step above normal rubber dome keyboards, it is painfully clear after coming back from mechanicals that this one isn't that. You do have to bottom out with these, and if you're used to mechanicals, it's easier to skip a beat because you'll be used to not having to ram these switches all the way down. Thankfully, that's where the high tactility of these switches comes in handy. On highly tactile rubber dome switches like these, if you manage to get over the tactile bump, it's much easier to bottom out by default, which ensures a high actuate to hit ratio. BTC Domeless Slider, still my favorite rubber dome system, is a perfect example of this as well. With these you basically have no choice but to bottom out, it's just way too tactile not to. I'd say the NMB switches are definitely one of the better rubber dome switches out there, not as good as BTC, Scorpius or Monterey Domeless Slider, or Topra for that matter, which is technically also a domeless slider switch, but way above normal rubber dome switches, and I prefer these over some of the crappier tactile mechanical switches even. The other QuietKey models didn't feel anywhere near as good, unfortunately, so I considered this to be the best of the QuietKey models. If you want to get one of these specifically, get one that has an FCC starting with AQ6, which is NMB's grantee code, and then that should land you this model. The full model number is RT7D5JTW. Anyway, onto the rest of the keyboard, which is unfortunately rather cheaply made. The QuietKey is a big batch of plastic, somehow managing to weigh in at 1.1 kilos, although is nowhere near as tough as the 8101 that it replaced. It flexes a lot, and it groans like the ghost of Christmas past when it does so. And although it can take more punishment than might appear at first sight, even the ones at the recycling center were not usually in too bad of a condition, it won't hold up to a good mechanical. It does have two-part flip-out feet, which I always like because I usually use the middle setting, as well as a three-part cable gutter like its predecessor. The keycaps are much the same cheap, lasered, thin ABS keycaps that were also on the later 8101 models, including the all-convex bottom row, except they use a different mount obviously. The lettering on this particular one is also very badly misaligned. You can see that the positions of all the legends are extremely inconsistent, which looks a bit stupid, and it's very eye-catching in this instance as well. Moreover, being ABS, they tend to yellow like crazy as well, although this one being new old stock has kept it from that fate obviously. Overall, I'd say it's a rather cheap keyboard, clearly a relic from a time in which costs on making keyboards had to be cut. It simply won't hold up against any decent mechanical at all, but, that said, it's still quite a few rungs above the average rubber dome. If you want a relatively quiet and quite tactile keyboard, this one is worth checking out. Because they're extremely common, and still a rubber dome keyboard after all, I wouldn't recommend buying it unless you can pick it up for some loose change, but it's young and mass-produced enough that there's a good chance there's one lying around in a storage cupboard at work or something, which you'll probably be allowed to take home with you. Anyway, that's it for this review. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it, and following is a typing demonstration of me typing on this keyboard.